There is a world you've never seen. A world where your great-grandmother checked her morning messages on a brass terminal in 1915, where the assassination of Archduke Franz Ferdinand was live-streamed to millions, where the First World War was fought not just with bullets and gas, but with information moving at the speed of light across copper arteries that spanned continents. In that world, the 20th century didn't belong to radio, then television, then computers. It belonged to something else entirely: the empire of wires. This is not science fiction. Every element of this technology existed in 1910. The telegraph, the telephone, the typewriter, punch cards, pneumatic tubes, electromagnetic relays. They were never combined. But what if they had been? What if one man, in one moment of clarity, had seen not individual inventions, but a system? What if the internet hadn't arrived in your parents' lifetime, but in your great-great-grandparents'? Would we have avoided catastrophe, or would we have simply accelerated toward it with perfect information and unstoppable momentum?
To understand what was lost, or perhaps prevented, we must first understand what truly existed in 1910. The world stood on the precipice of modernity. The telegraph had already knitted continents together for 60 years. Messages crossed oceans through underwater cables. Stock prices in London affected markets in New York within hours. The telephone was transforming urban communication. But these were separate systems, isolated islands of connectivity. In our timeline, computing emerged slowly: punch card systems in the 1890s, mechanical calculators, then decades of war and depression. The first electronic computers didn't arrive until the 1940s. The Internet, a network allowing any computer to speak to any other, wasn't conceived until the 1960s and didn't become public until the 1990s. It took humanity 80 years to connect the dots. But consider what existed in 1910. The telegraph network, already global, already instant, messages moving at electrical speed across hundreds of thousands of miles of wire. The telephone exchange, operators manually connecting calls through switchboards, a primitive but functional routing system. Punch card computing, Herman Hollerit's tabulating machines were already processing the 1890 U.S. Census. They could store, retrieve, and process information mechanically. The typewriter, standardized text input, the QWERT keyboard, the interface that would survive into the digital age. Pneumatic tube systems. Major cities used pressurized air tubes to move physical messages at 35 miles per hour through underground networks. New York, London, Paris, Berlin all had these Victorian internets, moving documents between buildings. Every component existed. They simply existed separately, serving different purposes, owned by different companies, imagined by different minds. In our world, no one unified them. But what if someone had?
Chapter 3. Point of Divergence, 7 to 12 a.m. Thomas Edison was 63 years old in 1910. His greatest inventions were behind him, or so history would record: the phonograph, the light bulb, the motion picture camera. He was wealthy, famous, and increasingly obsolete in a world moving toward AC power systems he'd fought against. But Edison was also a systems thinker. He didn't just invent light bulbs, he invented the entire electrical grid to power them. He understood that great fortunes came not from devices, but from networks, from infrastructure. In April 1910, during a meeting with Western Union executives about improving telegraph efficiency, Edison had a thought that in our timeline remained unspoken. What if we stopped thinking of communication as messages between two points? What if, instead, every telegraph station became a node? What if information could be stored at these nodes, cataloged, retrieved, shared? What if anyone could send not just to one recipient, but to an address, a permanent location in the network where information lived? Edison called it the electrical library system. Others would come to call it the wire. The concept was elegant. Combine telegraph networks with Hollerith punch card storage at major exchange points. Install typewriter terminals in homes and businesses. Use telephone switchboard principles to route messages not to people, but to permanent addresses, unique identifiers for each terminal. Messages would be stored on punch cards at local stations. Users would call these addresses, and the network would retrieve and transmit the stored information. It was email. It was file storage. It was the fundamental architecture of the Internet. And it could be built entirely with 1910 technology. Western Union saw the potential immediately, not for communication, they already owned communication, but for something more valuable, a permanent network that businesses would pay to access daily, subscription-based information infrastructure. By 1911, the first wire exchanges opened in New York, London, and Berlin. By 1913, 50,000 terminals were operating across North America and Europe. By August 1914, when a Serbian nationalist fired 2 shots in Sarajevo, 2.3 million people were connected to the wire, and they watched, in real time, through text updates transmitted every 15 minutes as the world went to war.
The first networked war, 1914 to 1918, World War I in this timeline was different from its inception. When Austria-Hungary issued its ultimatum to Serbia, the text wasn't simply published in newspapers the next morning. It was transmitted simultaneously to every wire terminal in Europe. Governments couldn't control the narrative. They couldn't delay information. They couldn't rely on distance and confusion. The cascade of mobilizations and declarations happened in full view of millions. Public opinion formed faster than ever before in human history. Peace movements organized across borders within hours. Anti-war activists in London coordinated with those in Berlin and Paris, sharing strategies, testimonies, and photographs through the wire. But so did nationalists. Propaganda spread instantly. Rumors moved faster than truth. The first viral conspiracy theories emerged, unverified claims about atrocities that inflamed hatred and made diplomatic solutions impossible. The wars still came, but it came with an audience. Governments attempted censorship. Britain's Defense of the Realm Act of 1914 included provisions to control wire content. Germany established the War Information Office to manage network messaging. But controlling a decentralized network proved nearly impossible. Information routed around censorship. Underground wire addresses proliferated. On the battlefield, the wire became a weapon. Military wire networks coordinated artillery strikes with unprecedented precision. Intelligence moved from observation posts to command centers in minutes, not hours. But it also meant soldiers could write home directly from the front. Families received messages from the trenches, unfiltered, uncensored, devastating. The romantic notion of war died faster in this timeline. By 1916, war exhaustion wasn't just among soldiers, it was universal. Everyone was connected to the suffering. The war ended in late 1918, not with parades, but with collapse. The German home front didn't just hear about defeats, they experienced them in real time through wire reports from the front. Revolution came swiftly. But it was the pandemic that truly revealed what the wire had created. The Spanish flu in a connected world in 1918 to 1920. The influenza pandemic killed 50 million people in our timeline. In this one, with instant global communication, the response was both better and worse. Medical information spread immediately. Doctors in New York shared treatment observations with colleagues in London and Tokyo in real time. The discovery of effective care protocols happened months faster. Quarantine measures coordinated across borders saved millions. But so did panic. Misinformation about causes and cures spread just as quickly as facts. Conspiracy theories about the disease being a biological weapon went viral, a term that would emerge early in this timeline. Cities saw riots when false wire reports claimed vaccines were poisonous. Trust in institutions eroded as contradictory information flooded the network. The wire saved lives. It also amplified fear. The Roaring Twenties, the first information economy, from from 1920 to 1929. The 1920s in this timeline exploded with network culture. Wire shows emerged, serialized tech stories delivered daily to millions of subscribers. The first true influencers appeared, writers who commanded enormous audiences through their wire channels. F. Scott Fitzgerald didn't just write novels. He maintained a wire channel with hundreds of thousands of followers who received his thoughts daily. Stock trading moved to the wire. Instant price updates meant markets moved with terrifying speed. Speculation became easier. So did manipulation. Entertainment transformed. Radio existed, but the wire offered something radio couldn't: interactivity. Users could request songs, vote on content, participate in collective experiences. The first network effects businesses emerged, services that became more valuable as more people joined. Catalogs went digital. Department stores maintained wire addresses where customers could browse inventory and place orders. The first version of e-commerce emerged 40 years early. When the stock market began to fall, the wire accelerated the crash. In our timeline, panic spread through newspapers and phone calls over days. In this one, it spread in minutes. Instant price updates meant millions of small investors watched their wealth evaporate in real time. The psychology of panic manifested at network speed. Sell orders flooded wire terminals faster than exchanges could process them. The system became the crisis amplifier. The Great Depression that followed was deeper, faster, more synchronized. When banks failed, wire messages sparked runs on institutions across the country within hours. Regional economic problems became national catastrophes instantly. But the Depression also revealed the wire's potential for coordination. Franklin Roosevelt's New Deal included the Federal Information Act of 1933, a program to install wire terminals in every public library and post office. Jobs programs were posted on the network, works projects coordinated through digital communication. The wire became infrastructure for economic recovery. Roosevelt's fireside chats weren't just on radio. They were distributed through the wire as text, reaching even remote communities. Political communication became direct, personal, and constant. Some historians in this timeline would argue that Roosevelt saved democracy by democratizing information access. Others argued he merely created the infrastructure for something darker. The Propaganda Network, 1933 to 1939. Joseph Goebbels understood the wire's power immediately. The Nazi regime nationalized Germany's wire network in 1933, establishing centralized control over information. The Ministry of Propaganda didn't just censor, it flooded the network. Official messages, party doctrine, and carefully crafted narratives dominated every terminal. But Goebbels also innovated. He created the first true algorithm, a manual system where popular messages were amplified, repeated, and promoted. He understood engagement metrics before they had names. Messages that provoked strong emotions spread faster. Fear and anger outperformed truth. The wire became a weapon of radicalization. Underground resistance networks also formed. Secret wire addresses, encrypted messages using one-time code pads. The first hackers were anti-fascist activists routing around totalitarian control. In the Soviet Union, Stalin took a different approach. The wire was restricted to party members and state institutions. Information became a privilege, a tool of control rather than mass manipulation. The Second World War, 1939 to 1945. The Second World War was fought on two fronts: physical and informational. Military wire networks became the backbone of operations. The Enigma machine was adapted to encode wire messages. Allied codebreakers at Bletchley Park weren't just intercepting radio signals, they were tapping in to access wire communications. The wire also spread the truth about the Holocaust faster than in our timeline. By 1942, detailed reports from witnesses reached Allied terminals. The world knew. Governments knew. The information couldn't be suppressed. It didn't stop the genocide, but it changed the post-war response. The war ended with nuclear weapons, just as in our timeline. But the wire carried something else. Instant, graphic descriptions of Hiroshima and Nagasaki from survivors. The world absorbed the horror of atomic warfare in real time. The nuclear age began not with ignorance, but with information overload.
Consequence. By 1960, the wire had existed for 50 years. 3 generations had grown up connected. The world had fought 2 networked wars. Markets moved at information speed. Political movements organized globally in hours. Entertainment was interactive and personalized. But something had been lost. Historians in this timeline began noticing a pattern. Societies with widespread wire access showed decreased regional cultural diversity. Ideas spread so quickly that local traditions couldn't develop before being subsumed by dominant cultural trends. Music, fashion, politics, everything homogenized faster. Political polarization intensified. People could choose their information sources, surrounding themselves with confirming viewpoints. Echo chambers emerged. The term appeared in academic literature by 1955. Democratic discourse didn't expand. It fragmented into tribal networks. The 1960s saw massive social movements accelerated by the wire, but also massive backlash. Governments developed sophisticated surveillance systems. In the United States, the FBI's wiretap program, officially the Networked Intelligence Observation Protocol, monitored millions of wire addresses without warrants. Privacy died early in this timeline. The question facing this world in the 1960s wasn't whether the wire was good or bad. It was whether humanity could control what it had created, or whether the network had already grown beyond control. By 1970, the wire was evolving beyond text, image transmission, eventually sound and video. The technology that in our world took from 1910 to 1990 to develop had arrived 60 years early. Humanity had gained 50 years of connectivity. The cost was 50 years of learning how to live with it. Chapter 6. Reflection/closing thought. In our world, we often believe that technology is neutral, that it's merely a tool, and only its use determines outcomes. But the wire timeline suggests otherwise. The internet arrived in our world when humanity was largely prepared for it. When democratic institutions were established, when literacy was nearly universal, when the Cold War had ended and the immediate threat of total annihilation had receded. Even then, we've struggled. Misinformation, polarization, surveillance, addiction, the erosion of privacy, and the weaponization of data. Imagine that struggle beginning in 1910, before universal education, during empires and world wars, before human rights conventions or data protection laws, before society had any framework for understanding what it meant to be constantly connected. The wire timeline teaches us something uncomfortable. Some technologies arrive not when they're possible, but when they're survivable. The internet arrived in our world when humanity was largely prepared for it, when democratic institutions were established, when literacy was nearly universal, when the Cold War had ended and the immediate threat of total annihilation had receded. Even then, we've struggled. In that alternate world, the empire of wires, humanity gained knowledge, but they lost something else: time. The slow accumulation of wisdom, the space between thought and broadcast, the ability to be alone with an idea before sharing it with millions. They gained connection and lost solitude. They gained speed and lost reflection. They gained information and lost the ability to forget. Perhaps some inventions shouldn't arrive when they're possible. Perhaps they should arrive when we're ready. And perhaps we're never ready.